Okay. Today, I've been the last probably month or so. I'm not even sure where it first kind of within the last month, 6 weeks or so, this came to my mind, or I came across this passage, John chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. It's a pretty familiar account, one of the miracles of Jesus healing a man at the pool. And this has kind of kept going back to me. I'm not sure why. I kind of feel like some of my sermons there's the same theme coming out over and over, and I'm not sure if that's because I need this or what it is, but I just kept coming back to this. And one of the things that the title I've taken from this passage from verse 7 in the NIV. He says, Jesus talking to this man, he says, I have no one to help me. And I think for myself, I see that myself sometimes, and I think all of us sometimes face that, where it feels like I have no one to help me. I don't have anyone there to help me. And there's some points that I'd like to pull from this passage, from this sermon as we go through this. I'm going to just share those real quick here at the beginning. That there is someone who sees me, there is someone who cares for me, and there is someone who heals me. As we go through this and kind of get our minds on that thought train there. So we'll just go ahead and read the first 11 verses of John chapter 5, and then look at it a little bit. So, verse 1 says, "After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, 'Do you want to be healed?' The sick man answered him, 'Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I am going, another steps down before me.' Jesus said to him, 'Get up, take your bed, and walk.' And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, 'It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed.' But he answered them, 'The man who healed me, that man said to me, take up your bed and walk.'" I think we'll stop there. The account goes on and focusing on kind of that this was a Sabbath day and kind of some things around that. But what I want to look at more is this section that we read, this first 11 verses here. The first verse here, we see Jesus is going to Jerusalem. It says after this. So before this, he had been in Galilee in the northern parts. In Nazareth, or I'm assuming in Nazareth, he was in Galilee, and he traveled down to Jerusalem. This sheep gate, from what I understand, would be in the northeast, for you, I guess, this way, as you're looking at a map, the northeast corner of Jerusalem, which makes sense. If Jesus was traveling down from Galilee area, that he would have possibly been coming through this section, entering the city through this section here. And it describes a pool called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. So there would have been, I don't know exactly if they were under one roof. There's colonnades would be rows of columns with a roof over it. And I don't know if this was all attached, one big roof, or there were separate roofed colonnades. It says there were roofed colonnades. And in this area, there was a multitude, it says, of individuals, people who are blind, lame, and paralyzed. And why were they there? If you have a King James Version Bible, and there's a few others, as you were following along my reading, you probably noticed that, some of you are shaking your heads, that I didn't read verse 4. And if you look in your ESV Bible or NIV, it skips from verse 3, goes directly to verse 5. So what's going on here? Why? What's happening here? I think it's important that we spend a little bit of time talking about this. For some of you, it may find this interesting, others may not. But if you note, at least in my Bible, most prints will have, even if it doesn't have the verse 4 in there, it will have a note to go down into the footnotes to see what's going on. And I'd like to read let's just read verse 3 and 4 together. As it says, in my Bible, it says, some manuscripts insert this as well. Verse 3, in these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water. And then verse 4, for an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred the water. Whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was healed of whatever disease he had. So, that kind of clarifies things a little bit, but why do some translations not have this verse in there? The way I understand it is when the ESV, for example, the NIV, some of the newer translations went to the ESV. I know was started. The whole process, I think, was started in the 80s, late 1980s, and into the 90s, and into the first of the 2000s. And when they started, they didn't just not writing the Bible, I guess, because they had other sources they pulled from. But some of those manuscripts that they pulled from were available to them that weren't, there were older manuscripts that predated manuscripts used for some of the other translations. And this verse, and there's other places in these texts that weren't in those earlier ones, the older ones. So the scholars who were pulling this version together, the ESV specifically, assumed, or it seemed apparent that John did not write this verse 4 in his original letter, because the older manuscripts did not have this included. But it doesn't necessarily make it less true. A lot of them agree that specifically for this verse 4 here would have been the thought at the time. At the time, this is would have been considered true, that the angel came down from heaven, stirred the waters, and the people were healed. And there's other people who argue and say, no, it was more of a placebo effect, that they really healed? It was a spring that was bubbling. You can find all kinds of different thoughts on this. But at any rate, there was a multitude of people gathered at this side of this pool who believed it. They honestly, seriously believed that if they could get in there when the waters moved, they would be healed. And this man was one of them. He was waiting on the side of this pool. It says that he had been lame for 38 years. So he had been an invalid for longer than Jesus had been on this earth. He would have been, for the whole life of Jesus' earthly life, he would have been an invalid and more. And it says that he was there for a long time. The first thing we see here in verse 6 is that Jesus saw him. That's our first point. There is someone who sees me. Jesus saw him, first of all. In the middle of this multitude, what was different about him? What made him stand out to Jesus? Why did Jesus zero in on this one person? It doesn't give us a lot of details about the other people that were there. But I just from gathering from this account, I think maybe he was the only one that Jesus healed in that multitude of people wanting to be healed. Jesus noticed him. And I was thinking about how that applies to us. While we do take encouragement from not being the only one, the saying, misery loves company, and that's true to a large extent, and in numbers there's safety. When we're going through a tough time, it does feel good to know that I'm not the only one dealing with this. I'm not the only one who's ever faced this. I'm not the only person who's dealt with this. But in the midst of that, sometimes we can feel alone. Sometimes we can feel that loneliness, that we can feel alone and lonely in the middle of a crowded room. I don't know if you've ever heard that expression, but I've felt that sometimes, where it feels like I'm lonely in the middle, in this multitude of people. And the thing I want us to remember is that Jesus does see us. There is someone who sees us. And in the middle of the multitude of people, that Jesus sees us. He notices each one of us individually. He walked up to this man, whatever it was, he came up to this man, and he said, "Do you want to be healed?" And we see this man's response. In verse 7, like I said, "I have no one to help me," is what it says in the NIV. Here in the ESV, it says, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool. I have no one to carry me into the pool when the water is stirred up." Isn't that sad? That here was this man in the middle of this multitude of people, and he had nobody to help him. I have no one to help me. Maybe you can identify with that. Like I said, I can at times. It feels like I don't know who I would even ask for help. There's nobody that wants to help me. I have no one to help me. If that is your reality, hopefully, it can be our reality at times. But we as a church, we as a body are called to notice others, notice those people around us. But sometimes in the church is the very place where people go unnoticed. And I think if I'm going unnoticed, sometimes it's my fault because I put on this front of, I'm perfect. Yeah, everybody, what do you say when you walk in the door and the greeters greet you at the door and they say, "How are you this morning?" "Oh, I'm doing good. Yeah, I'm great. How are you?" And because, or in Rose, they wouldn't have time if I'd stop and tell them, well, dump on them, I guess. Or whoever the greeter is that Sunday. Or as we commune together, do we put on a front? Are we vulnerable? Are we open? Do we share what's really going on and how we could be helped? Philippians 2, verses 1 through 4, it says, "So if there is any encouragement in Christ, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others." We're called as a body to look out for each other, to care for each other. And I think, like I said, I think it's dependent on both sides. I think it's dependent on the one who needs that comfort, the person that is in that place of hurting, and on the people around them, gathering around them, being willing to reach out and notice. Paul also says in 1 Corinthians 12, when he talks about the body, that if one member is hurting, our whole member, the whole body is hurting. That's the way it should be. If one part is hurting, everything hurts and focuses on it. It's a challenge for us to be aware of those around us. But even in those times, when we're in the middle of a multitude and we feel alone, there is someone who sees me. So, getting back to verse 6 here, Jesus walks up to him And he says, do you want to be healed? I don't know if you've ever heard the term, I hesitate to even say it, but have you heard the term a stupid question? I'm not at all implying that Jesus asked a stupid question or that he was stupid in any way, but in my mind, there's a pretty obvious answer to this. And I wondered, why did Jesus ask him this? And I think maybe, I don't know for sure, but I think maybe it was for this man to see what his response would be, for this man himself to have to give a response to Jesus. But it would seem pretty obvious. It wasn't just oh, why are you here? It seems pretty obvious to me why this man was there was to be healed. He wanted to be healed, along with all those multitude of other people with hurts and with whatever was going on. They were all there to be healed. And it seems pretty obvious to us. But it also shows that Jesus cared. There's someone who cares for me. There's someone who cares for me and loves me. Jesus did that. He walked up to this man and, like I said, picked him out of this crowd. First he saw him, and then he walked up to him and says, do you want to be healed? Caring about him. Sometimes, like I said, we ask well, how are you today? And that we can stay kind of surface. But maybe for us, maybe we should think of a deeper question we can ask someone. I don't know what that is. But maybe if we'd ask a deeper question, we might get a deeper response. We might have to dig a little bit and say, well, how are you really doing? And, oh, well, yeah. Do you have time to listen? And then go into what's really going on. The second point, someone cares for me. Jesus cared for this man. And we see this man's response. Like I said, this is nobody cares for me. I've got no help. He said, in my mind, he was saying, I would love to be healed, but I can't do what's required of me. I can't follow these steps. I can't get to what I'm supposed to do. I can't follow these steps. He had tunnel vision. Have you ever had tunnel vision? I've been guilty of having tunnel vision sometimes, of thinking this is what the steps I need to follow. This is what needs to happen. This is how it needs to go. This man, in his mind, he thought when the water is stirred, what needs to happen is I need to get there and get in there first before anybody else. That is my goal. That's how I need to do this. And he had tunnel vision about it. And I think I can get that way. I think we all maybe can be guilty of that sometimes, of having a preconceived idea of how God is going to do this. And sure, it's a miracle, but this is how it's going to be because I've got it figured out. Well, Jesus could have said, well, okay, we'll sit here with you, me and my disciples, we'll sit here with you, we'll wait for you for the water till the water's moving, and then we'll dunk you in real quick. We can hurry you over there, and we can do this. But he didn't. Jesus said, well, I've got a better way. Let's do it my way. Something that this man had no idea. He hadn't even conceived of this idea. Jesus just simply, in verse 8, he says, get up, take up your bed, and walk. Just that simple. Jesus said, I've got an easier way. Yeah, we could go through this process over here. We could do it the way you want to see this fulfilled. Sometimes in my prayers, I get specific of how I want God to answer them. I give him some broad hints sometimes because it seems like he can't figure it out. But I have this idea, and sometimes God says, well, okay, I'm going to do it this way. And looking back, it's so beautiful. After we're through that, we look back and we say, oh, that's what God was doing. Now it makes sense. When I thought he wasn't hearing me, or when I thought he was resisting my idea, he had a much bigger and better idea over here. And that's what this man experienced. Jesus just simply said, get up, take up your bed, and walk. And then verse 9, it says, and at once the man was healed. I think he had to make an effort to stand up. Because of the next phrase there, it says, and he took up his bed and walked. I think he did the first part. I think he got up. I think he stood up, and at once the man was healed. He made an effort to follow what Jesus told him to do. Something that I'm assuming would have been out of the question was for him to stand up and walk. But Jesus told him to, and he did. He was obedient, and he did it. And that is the third point. There is someone who heals me. But there's a change that happened here. There is a change that came over this man. He took up his bed, and he walked. He went home. He didn't need to be hanging out next to that pool anymore. He didn't need to be waiting for the angels to come stir that water anymore. I came across this saying this week. I don't know who to attribute this to, but it says, pride leads to a fall, fear leads to confusion, rebellion leads to destruction, laziness leads to poverty, ignorance will lead you nowhere, but faith in Jesus leads to change. I think sometimes that change from the old man, from my old ways to the new, is what I don't really want. I don't want to put in the work. I want the change, but I see myself too often still sitting there beside that pool because that's what I've always done. That's where I've been. That's kind of where I've hung out. Well, what do I do now? Where do I go? But we don't need to be hanging out by that pool anymore. We need to be up. We need to have change. We need to walk. I'm talking about spiritual healing and restoration. Jesus offers that to us. But if we don't make a change, if we don't put in the effort to move on, to walk, to get up and walk, and we're still hanging out there, still sitting there, because I've just been used to this. I've gotten this rut of just always doing that. There needs to be a change. The change that follows that restoration, that healing. We see this man simply obeyed the instruction that Jesus gave him. He picked up his bed and walked. Sometimes those in restoration, sometimes in relationships, we have to take steps, we have to do things. I had to think of Aura's story, was it last week or whenever it was, about the man who came and apologized to him, and that beautiful illustration of what happens when we apologize to someone, when we make something right, or they do to us. You know, that's always a heavy time. I've experienced that often, where like I don't want to go and say, I'm sorry for the way I treated you, or I'm sorry for what I said, or I'm sorry for what I called you, or those types of things. Those are hard things to do. But, and usually the thought process with that is, I'll look like an idiot. Man, they'll think less of me. But usually the opposite is true, often, is the people that we apologize to, or if that happens to you, you know the response. It's like, oh, wow, freedom. That burden is lifted. That pressing is gone. It's lifted. It's gone. And that's the change that I'm talking about. That sometimes some of those things require us to do. Now, here at the end of these verses 9 through 11, we do see that this man met some opposition. It says that he was walking. He had his bed and he was walking. And there's a note in here. It says it was the Sabbath day. It was on the Sabbath day when they weren't supposed to be doing anything. In verse 10, it says, so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, it is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed. This was against their law. They were not supposed to be carrying stuff or this type of thing. So I do know that sometimes we will meet opposition. These people the focus was not on the fact that this man had been an invalid for 38 years. He is healed. He's well. This is a miracle. Jesus performed a miracle here. Someone performed a miracle here. That was not the focus. And we could argue, well, they didn't even know this man. But they didn't take the time to ask either. Maybe the best response would have been, why are you carrying your bed on the Sabbath? Instead of coming at him with a critical attitude. But they were critical of him because they were focused on, well, you can't do that. You're not supposed to be doing that. That's not the way it's supposed to work. I think they had a lot of tunnel vision too. That you should not be doing this. They totally missed the point of the miracle that Jesus had performed. They totally missed that he had been healed. And I think it's interesting, this man in verse 11, he says, the man who healed me, that man said to me, take up your bed and walk. That was enough of an answer. For him, it was like, well, I don't really care if you like it or not. The man who healed me told me to do this. I'm going to do it. And I think, well, I love that answer. I think that's enough sometimes. When there is critical accusations, critical spirit, if we're sure, if we are confident that we are in God's will, that we are following what God is calling us to do, sometimes that's enough. Just say, well, this is what God is asking of me to do, and I am going to do it. I have no one to help me. There is someone who sees me. There is someone who cares for me. There is someone who heals me, and that someone is Jesus. Frank Graff. Does that name sound familiar to anybody? It's not very surprising. He was born in 1860, and he became a pastor. I think it was in Pennsylvania. He was a pastor, and he was well known, or at least in his area, to be a very outgoing, very joyful, very happy person. And as a pastor, he had opportunities to do that. But in his 40s, which it was around the turn of the century, the late 1800s, he went through some things. I don't know exactly what he went through, what he faced, but he was in a deep depression. He wrote later, he says, my whole attitude had become one of despair and defeat. And because of this, I was living a life of unhappiness and failure. With each passing day, I fell deeper and deeper into the slough of despair until finally I felt I could stand it no longer. Sorry to take away from his what he wrote there, but he fell into this deep depression. And it was going with him from day to day. And he just felt like he couldn't get through. And he did one thing. He as a pastor, he was familiar with a lot of hymns. He started singing hymns. One hymn that hit him was one day he was singing, "What a friend we have in Jesus, all our sins and griefs to bear." And where it talks about casting all our cares on him, bringing everything to God in prayer. He was reading that, or singing that, and he was hit with this thought. He was asking, well, does God care about me? And he said in his heart, he says, I know he cares. I know my Savior cares. And if that phrase sounds familiar, it's because he went on to write the song, Does Jesus Care? And I'd like to just, in closing, read the verses. And then I've asked Matt if maybe we could read or sing maybe the first verse in the chorus after prayer. I think it's 740, 470. I'm sorry, number 470 in the hymnals. If you want to look it up. The first verse says, "Does Jesus care when my heart is pained too deeply for mirth and song, as the burdens press and the cares distress, and the way grows weary and long? Does Jesus care when my way is dark with nameless dread and fear? As the daylight fades and deep night shades, does he care enough to be near? Does Jesus care when I've tried and failed to resist some temptation strong? When for my deep grief I find no relief, though tears flow all the night long? Does Jesus care when I've said goodbye to the dearest on earth to me, and my sad heart aches till it nearly breaks? Is it aught to him does he see?" And then the chorus, we know, comes in with a resounding, "Oh, yes, he cares. I know he cares. His heart is touched with my grief. When the days are weary and the long nights dreary, I know my Savior cares." And this was written, like I said, in a time of this pastor, Frank Graff, going through a difficult time and knowing in his heart full well that Jesus cares. He sees us, he cares for us, and he heals us. With that, let's stand for prayer.